Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 2 of the main show of Tekken Talks. I think this week we can just get right into it. I'm not going to do much of an introduction other than my name's Isaac. I'm your host. Wow, this is so standard introductions. Anyway, this week, two topics that I want to hit on. One is regional play styles. So, kind of there are different main Tekken regions and kind of breaking down how the individual playstyles differ between them. And of course, with the regions I'm more familiar with, we can maybe go into a bit more depth. So that actually will include, despite not living in that region, talking a bit about JDCR versus Knee in terms of their differences in playstyle, what really makes them both icons of the Korean Tekken playstyle, as well as very different. And we'll also maybe hit on Anakin versus Jimmy J. Tran slash just general differences in Tekken playstyle among some top players. And then transitioning from that, we will go into the quote unquote Tekken 7 meta and a conversation about what makes up the meta of Tekken. I will be specifically talking about Tekken 7 because it's what I'm most familiar with, but we'll kind of approach it from a bunch of different angles. So one will be talking about the traditional Tekken meta that a lot of people think of. The Tekken meta of movement and pokes. What is it? It's a bunch of backdashing and a couple of jabs, down forward ones. That's Tekken meta at its purest form. It's purity, pure Tekken. And then we'll kind of talk about maybe some different views on what can make up the Tekken meta, as well as some potentially novel ideas about what's really important in the Tekken quote unquote meta, if there is one, if you believe there to be a Tekken meta in the first place. So, yeah, welcome. Let's get started. So, to start our conversation about the Tekken 7 playstyles, regional playstyles, the differences between them, etc., I think it's important to start with the one regional playstyle that I think most people are not only familiar with, but actually understand why it's a regional playstyle, such why it's specific to the given region, and that is, of course, the general Korean playstyle that a lot of people talk about. Most people, when they say Korean playstyle, they typically mean Knee's playstyle in particular, slash quote unquote perfect play. What is this? Why do people hold it in such high regard? Well, especially in Knee's case, and we'll kind of talk mainly about Knee's playstyle as being representative of the general Korean playstyle, and we'll get into some problems with that. But the general idea is, all right, so you're going to use movement, mainly, primarily, um, a Korean backdash as well as sidewalking to generate whiffs from your opponent and punish them. And essentially, what ties that knot together is using your knowledge of frame data and safety, so that you can execute that game plan while minimizing risk to yourself, right? So if you watch me, for instance, most of the moves he's gonna use are very safe and very quick. And the reason why he does that is because you can't just wait around for your opponent to whiff. You actually have to be actively doing something while moving around and while applying that fundamental idea of using movement to generate opportunities so that you can punish your opponent, right? So, for instance, if you watch his Kazuya against Arsenal Nash in the Evo Grand Finals, I bring this example up because I'm sure many people have watched this. His jab is pretty much his primary tool in that entire game, and other than that, he's really just moving to try and generate uh, whiffs from Arslan. And it's not as simple as, oh, I can just move around and wait and move around randomly. All these movement choices at this level are very, very intentional. So it's not just move mix-ups that Nia is thinking about, it's movement mix-ups. Um, and note, obviously, Arslan is also thinking about these things at an even higher level, but we're focusing on Nia right now. Um, so Arslan might do a down forward one. You'll notice Nia might do a sidestep duck if he doesn't get a big whiff and he just sees a block, he might jab. But if Arslan starts doing down forward one, he might apply a different strategy like a backdash and so on and so forth. So even the movement itself is all very calculated and part of a mind game. This might surprise people, or not surprise people, but to maybe more novice Tekken players, it may look like they're just backdashing, like spam, spam, backdash, wait, especially prior to Arslan. So prior to the Pakistani arrival on the international scene, especially if you look at like the 2016, 2017 top Tekken matches, it may really just look like they're just backdashing like ferociously and waiting for a whiff, kind of unintentionally. And I think even more so, though it wasn't random in any sense, and there's even subtleties within the movement. So, how long are you holding down back in your Korean back dash input, depending on the situation, depending on your opponent, depending on your confidence and their mix-up ability, et cetera, et cetera. For instance, you might watch people play against Boa Love, the Kazu player from Korea, and their backdash, the top players, when they play against them, their backdash will be a lot more not slow, but there will be many more frames where they're holding the down back input and their backdash won't look quite as jittery. And that's partially because Boa's specialty is a 50-50 mix-up essentially, and he's so good at applying it that they recognize that they can minimize their risk by backdashing in a way that's covering both low blocking as well as mid blocking, um, most of the time, as opposed to prioritizing one. So that's this kind of Korean style of play that I think has been slightly romanticized and idealized because the Koreans and the Korean players were the best players in the world at Tekken for a very long time. And it's interesting, like the meta, the quote unquote meta that, and we'll get more into this, but the style of play is really very old in terms of relative to Tekken 7, but really came around in terms of Tekken years relatively early, right? I mean, this style of play, if you watch Tekken Tag 1 videos, it's pretty much they were applying the same principles, which, um, is fine. And they kind of have continued evolving that quote unquote Korean style of perfect play. So let's now talk about why that might be an oversimplification of, oh, it's just movement and pokes, right? And we'll get more into this in the meta conversation, but I think we can start to understand how there are different play styles and why the different play styles arrive if we understand the differences in play styles just amongst the Korean style of play slash quote unquote perfect play. So, in my interpretation, there's a spectrum in the Korean style of play. On one end, you pretty much have Ni and Ni style of play, which truly is stay within the frames, play as safe as possible, um, use movement to generate whiffs, et cetera, et cetera. Um, However, recently, I think he has been starting to change that, especially his evolution of his Kazuya and stuff like that. But anyway, so that's Ni, or the definitely pre-Arslan Ni. Pre-Arslan Ni, this is what the playstyle was. And then on the other side of the spectrum, I'm actually going to put JDCR's playstyle, which might be controversial because I think a lot of people, when they think of Korean style of play or perfect play, they think of JDCR, but I actually don't think he falls into that category in the same way Nee does, and I actually think they're quite polar opposites in terms of how they approach the game on the in terms of their gameplay, right? Of course, I can't speak on behalf of their thoughts, but I can only analyze their gameplay, and this is kind of the differences that you can see. And so JDCR's style of play, on the other hand, I would say is framed more in terms of a psychological aspect of Tekken and understanding their opponent, not necessarily through perfect play, not necessarily through safety and uh, well, definitely movement, but not necessarily through safety of pokes and etc. But through the Tekken system as a whole, whatever that takes, whether that means backswing blows, whether that means crazy movement, whether that means just ducking up, doing whatever. I think JDCR's main focus in his playstyle is first and foremost the psychological aspect of Tekken. And he talked about this on Level Up Your Game. Check out Level Up Your Game's YouTube channel with Rip and JDCR, where JDCR refers to something as like these ratios um, in certain situations based on his experience with the opponent. And pretty much what that is given the history of how your opponents acted in the game and in specific situations, what's the probability they're going to do these certain moves? And then you can maybe get the expected value of those moves. So you're multiplying the probability of those moves times maybe how good they are slash how safe they are once you evaluate how good this move is. Um, and so I would kind of phrase it like this: like JDCR, he uh, he uses psychology of an opponent and kind of the mental game and understanding people as a base, and then uses frame data, movement, the Tekken 7 mechanics to exploit that. Whereas Nee, I would argue, very much uses frame data and movement as a base to then learn about his opponent. And there's a very subtle difference here, and it might seem somewhat superficial, but I can give you two, I think, matches that really, really show this property off and that really make this very kind of explicit in terms of the different ways you can operate while remaining in this kind of Korean style of play, which is based around movement. For me, go watch the grand finals of him and Qdon's, where he was basically using Lily. This was like the first time he did this versus Qdon's Devil Jin. So it's Nee's Lily versus Qdon's Devil Jin. I believe this was Tokyo Masters 2018. Go watch that game. Um, I mean, yes, Nee was playing against Qdon's in the sense that, he obviously needs a read on his timing. He needs a general understanding of Qdon's spacing, habits, his strategy, etc. But let's just be honest. When you watch that match, Nee was playing against Devil Jin. Nee was not playing against Qdon's the person. Nee was 1000% playing against Devil Jin. Every single situation in that match, you watch it and you're like, oh, yeah, he spent, an hour in practice mode for that one tiny situation. That how well can Lily deal with Laser Scraper? He spent 5 hours studying how well Lily can deal with the Laser Scraper. This is speculation, and he decided, Lily's my counter pick to beat Kudans, who's currently, destroying everyone. And he humiliated Kudans in that match. And it wasn't the traditional sense of humiliation of, oh, I have the download. It's hard to even see the psychological aspect of that match. it's really in every situation, I'm going to optimize my expected value, my expected return in terms of almost purely frames and movement, with a nice twinkling of timing and understanding cooldowns as a player. Um, I'm not saying that, again, I'm really not saying that there was no psychological aspect involved, but I think after that match, a lot of people were like, needs a robot. I think it's actually been an interesting mislabeling almost, calling JDCR a robot, like the robot. That's like his nickname among some community members. When really, Nee, I think, much more demonstrates this kind of cold strategy, um, based around numbers and probability. Whereas JDCR, the match I want you to check out is, I think he did a first to 5, first to 10. I don't quite remember which one, versus low high. If you just look up low high JDCR first two, it was from this year, or last year, excuse me, 2020. And JDCR just destroyed him. And that is the exact opposite of the Q Downs versus Devil Jin match, where JDCR is 1000% playing low high. He is playing against low high. Low high picks Steve. JDCR, he labbed Steve very heavily. He said this in a post match interview. But one of the main things he did was just watch low high's footage. And in the match, it's so evident because JDCR is not staying within quote unquote frame safety. His movement is not necessarily optimal to play against Steve. He's not backdashing out of range of down forward 2 and back 1 all the time. He's doing a lot of asynchronous things that it's like, oh, well, that's not traditionally how one might play against Steve. And he's just playing unga bunga, he's going crazy. But no, that's what happens when you have a psychological read on your opponent. Once you have a psychological read on your opponent, unsafe moves and moves that Nee might not touch in long sets, especially in long sets, JDCR was exploiting like crazy, like Dragunov's down forward too, at seemingly random times, but they're not random. They're only random in terms of if two robots are playing. Right? We'll get into the Tekken 7 meta more and more. I keep saying this, but this is so important. One of the main points is Tekken is not really like chess. Right? In chess at the highest level, the psychology aspect of it is a very important part. You can hear the top players, uh, talk about how important it is. But, we have chess engines. And in general, we understand that at each, especially because it's a strictly turn-based game, each position is its own world wherein there are objectively better moves than non-objective than other moves, right? And in many positions, there's an objectively best move. Um, and yes, you might say, well, humans, they can't really find those moves. Well, one, a lot of the time they do. And two, in Tekken, it's a bit different because your opponent always has an option to negate pretty much what you're going to do, right? They always have a crazy, well, quote unquote crazy, but an unexpected option because it's a synchronous, battle, right? It's not I take a turn, then you take a turn. And because of this, their psychological aspect really emerges, right? If Tekken was, I'm going to block a move, I'm going to press my button to advance the screen one frame at a time because it's my turn, and then I'm going to press a button, and then I have to wait for you to press a button, and so on and so forth, or to move, then Tekken would be like chess. But right now, it's not like chess, and it allows for JDCR to express himself and express his playstyle in a much more psychological way, or psychologically based way than maybe Nee does, on the surface. Of course, yeah. So that's kind of the Korean style of play. I mean, I'll give one last analogy and then we can move on. You can kind of imagine, for those of you who are familiar with sports and soccer in particular, um, it's kind of like a Messi Ronaldo situation, right? Imagine me is like Ronaldo in that when you watch Ronaldo, if for those who don't know what I'm talking about, maybe you can check some highlights. But I'll give a quick explanation. All of Ronaldo's greatest plays, his best goals, when you watch them, you feel the amount of hours of practice in every single one of them. It's like everything he's done a million times. You can see everything he's done is a product of pure hard work and mechanics of the game and of the body, and it's just absurd. It's one of the most impressive sights, in the world. So knee is like Ronaldo in that sense, right? Everything when you watch it, you see the practice mode hours, you see the understanding at a very technical and kind of low level, right? And then if you watch Messi, it's like the exact opposite. It's indescribable. You can't go to the training ground and try something 1,000 times and be able to get to what Messi can do. Note that you can't do that in Ronaldo's case because nobody works as hard as Ronaldo for one, and Ronaldo does also have a tremendous amount of natural talent. But with Messi, there's like this intangible, hard to pin down side of things, and that intangible, hard to pin down side of things in Messi's case, I think just the general genius when it comes to the game of soccer, whereas in JDCR's case, I think that intangible property may just well be the psychological side of things. Just want to make a quick note. I recorded a segment about regional playstyles and expanded to Americas and Europe. I wasn't really very proud of it, so I left it out. But if it seems like there's a bit of a chop in between the first segment and the second segment, that's why. Thank you for understanding. Welcome back. Welcome back. In this Tekken 7 meta discussion, I think I covered a lot of things that I actually wanted to say in the first half of the playstyle. I'm talking about regional playstyles and specifically the Korean style of play that I wanted to talk about in this half, but I wanted to get a bit more into details about kind of different notions of what the Tekken 7 meta is and why I think there's actually a mindset that might be a bit limiting in both how people approach the game and just the overall game's potential. So what is that mindset? And that mindset is pretty much that the Tekken 7 meta is poking and movement. The Tekken 7 meta is Knee's play style. You know, a lot of I think people adhere to this because it's actually a simplification, in my opinion, of the Tekken 7 system, right? Tekken 7's the hardest game. Tekken 7's so complex. But we're actually just gonna make that complexity movement. It's so complex and detailed, and there's so many things to think about. But you just have to Korean backdash. All Tekken is Korean backdash and down forward one. That's what Tekken 7 is. That's what embodies Tekken 7. Well, there's a lot of things wrong with this, I think. One is that it seems outdated. I don't know that much about the Tekken 5 days or older Tekkens, but I'm guessing the way this started was that when Koreans were dominating, you had to adhere to this belief because the best players in the world all played like this, right? Or all appeared to be playing like this. Um, all I see is, backdashing to range 5, wave dashing in, back dashing out, wave dashing in, down forward 1, sidestep, down forward 1, sidestep, back dash out, right? And so this is Tekken 7. This is the Tekken 7 meta. Well, if we just talk about characters who can fulfill that gameplay style, and you're gonna be getting the best results by just doing that with those characters, you're maybe looking at 5 characters, 3 characters in the cast, maybe. Kazumi, yes. It's hard to argue Kazumi is not played optimally when she is adhering to this. Um, well, she doesn't even have to be adhering to this when it appears that she's adhering to this. So when a Kazumi player is playing, it looks like all they're doing is movement and pokes, and that movement and pokes is what their game is totally revolved around, which I think is a misconception. Maybe Shaheen, maybe, but so there's that. But I want to push back on this notion a bit because I think we've seen that this is just outdated and that Tekken is not that simple. Right? Everyone who says this also says Tekken is the most complicated game, and then they immediately simplify it by saying you just have to know a couple of numbers, you just have to get really good at Korean backdash, know how to sidestep, and wait for a whiff before pressing a button, because if you press the button, your hitbox will be expanded, which is true, and you should do that. But that's the game. So simultaneously, it's the most complicated game ever, according to some people, but it's the most easy to describe game ever. You cannot describe Street Fighter as simply as, oh yeah, it's footsies and fireballs. No Street Fighter, every Street Fighter player would go crazy if you said that was the entire game. But with Tekken, for some reason, a lot of people get away with, oh yeah, Tekken is movement and pokes. That is Tekken. Tekken is backdashing. Let's just break down some examples of why this is nowhere near the case. One, um, if you actually ask the best players in the world, and you don't even have to look to the best players in the world, you just have to look at people who are winning um, uh, a lot in any level of play. Mind games and the cycle and understanding your opponent is the most important thing. And he even says this, even though he's the one who most adheres to a notion of perfect play. He will even tell you that mind games are the most important aspect of Tekken. So right away, Tekken's meta being movement is a weird statement because movement is meaningless unless you understand your opponent and unless you're actively understanding the situations that you've been in and how they've reacted and played. Right? Movement is just a tool in the toolbox of expressing kind of this communication between you and your opponent, or this dance between you and your opponent. It's kind of like if, I'm not a classically trained musician. This might be a trash analogy, so excuse me. But it's kind of like if people were like, classical music is melody. It is melody, that is all that it is. Melody is, you know, all without melody, there is no classical music. Sure, that's true. Or there is no music even. Maybe you can make that case. But there's pitch, tone, there's phrasing, there's tempo, there's all these other things. And ultimately, that's not the most important thing about music. The most important thing about music is likely the final product and how these things come together, to create a beautiful piece of music. Again, not a classical musician, so if I totally butchered that analogy, that's my bad. Um, and so, what are the examples? Where's my proof of this other than, people say it? Well, it's a good question. We can look at some matches, right? We can look at I'm Musician versus Atif Butt. We can look at the Pakistani scene in general and a lot of their top players. If you watch, you know, the Pakistanis play a lot on their stream, they're not backdashing like crazy. They're it's not this poke poke backdash. It's not this rubber banding, right? It's not this rubber banding Mishima image that I think a lot of people have of backdashing, wave dashing, maybe a couple side steps, kind of all revolving around this rubber band. That does actually exist in the movement system in terms of the 3D perspective, not to confuse you. But there's actually maybe more forward dashing than there is backdashing. And there's way more buttons than I think people want to admit. And note, this is the highest level of play. The Pakistani region is the strongest region, I think, unquestionably. No one almost, don't tell me the LCQ because that's a very small sample size. But for the most part, when Pakistanis have attended tournaments, they have dominated. Even if they're not winning, they're in the top 16. They have made, low high, Atif Butt made low high look like a chump, even though low high did beat Owais Honey after adapting. But in general, they're the strongest region. Right? They're going to press way more buttons, and they're going to do way more quote unquote unsafe things that fits into the bubble of poke and movement. But that's the Tekken 7 meta. They're going to forward dash more than they backdash a lot of times. If they do backdash, a lot of the times it's two Korean backdashes at most. Because the meta is an evolving thing and it's really just not as simple as movement and pokes and this idealized um, vision of it. So, what is it? Well, I think it's evolving and I think it's hard to say. I do think that Tekken is so complicated that it's hard to wrap the meta up in a couple sentences. But, you can see things like the fact that the range that you want to be playing in has really evolved over time. It's so hard to find examples of top players being in range for anything more than a split second, right? Because really, I could argue that movement is it's really just part of a decision making package, right? Because if I'm playing optimally, I have to be in range of my opponents to do attacks almost all the time, right? Even if so there's that, but that might not be optimal because of the psychology side of things. But hypothetically, you want to be in range so that you can always damage your opponent, but also in range so that your defensive options are not totally obsolete. So consider a scramble or a situation where your opponent's at +3, maybe after a move on hit. You're in force crouch. You're not in force crouch, but so you have a lot of buttons and a lot of moves with a bunch of different properties at your disposal. You have backdash, and maybe this is what people mean by movement, right? In these situations, you have backdash, which maybe is the safest maneuver, and maybe is the most likely to get your opponent to whiff and for you to get damage, right? So maybe that's what people mean by movement being so paramount. And you have sidestep, right? Maybe sidestep will option select most of these things. But I don't think it's as clear cut in all these situations because, okay, well, I also have hop kick maybe. And yes, that is more risky, but the reward could maybe be a lot greater, right? Because if my opponent does a down one and I'm sidestepping or I'm backdashing, there's a decent chance that my reactions are not, good enough to punish someone's full crouch down one on whiff, which is a very hard thing to punish on whiff. Or if someone does a jab, you know, I'm not going to get damage from three Korean backdashes avoiding that jab, but I'm going to get damage from a generic down four, because maybe I have that read. And well, what if you don't have that read? Well, if nobody has the read ever, then you are playing chess and it's like a Markov decision process and you're just guessing. Sorry for that terminology. You can ignore what I said in the past 5 seconds. But, iMusician versus a Teeth Butt. Is anyone going to argue that iMusician has better quote unquote movement than a Teeth Butt? Well, yeah, if you look at Yoshi's spins and Yoshi's specific movement options, you might even win that argument. iMusician humiliated a Teeth Butt at the TWT finals. He absolutely obliterated him, and it had nothing to do with pokes, right? So that's the poke side of things. It had nothing to do with pokes. It had to do with what's the best thing in a situation when I have the read on the opponent, which I hate to break it to you, might not just be Korean backdashing. I mean, you know, people with worse movement and poking can very often beat if better people in those categories if they have a psychological read or if they have momentum. Again, I'll go back to that poke chop example when he destroyed. I'm pretty sure John Ding was there, and John Ding has maybe the best movement, at least backwards movement in the world. And so let's not say Tekken is the most complicated game and then immediately simplify the meta or immediately say this is what Tekken is. When I think the beautiful thing about Tekken is that it's way more complicated or way more in depth than I think people than we all thought, right? Because we're seeing how effective different styles of play are, aka the Pakistani style of play, aka even Nobi slash a lot of Japanese players are not adhering to this standard image of this perfect Korean style of play. And, it's hard to say Korea is as dominant as they were because they're not. And the game looks different. The game does not look like rubber banding Mishimas. I'm sorry, I hate to break it to you. If you want to romanticize Tekken in that way, that's fine. And you can say the game I want is rubber banding Mishimas, and I want the mind game to just be trying to get my opponent to whiff. But is that interesting? Or is the communication, the dance, the dialogue you're having with your opponent, whether that's through movement, whether that's through buttons, whether that's through blocking or through anything, I think that's the interesting side of Tekken. I think the mental side of Tekken that differentiates it from something like chess, where again the psychological aspect is huge, but until we have an AI whose obviously reflexes have to be limited, right? Because we can't just have bots blocking everything. And they show that okay, if we level the playing field in terms of reflexes and whatnot, then there is an optimal way, and it is just down forward one and backdash. Until we have something that proves that that's the case, or that demonstrates that that's the case, which can beat every human, then in the human realms, in the human side of things, there's so much evidence to the contrary that Tekken is just not that simple. It's just not that easy, right? How come a player who's better than someone else can absolutely destroy them with no backwards movement, just blocking and forward dashing? I understand that oftentimes when you say the meta, you're referring to people of equal skill level. But even if that is the case, right? I mean, I have training partners who I personally believe when they play on a different periphery, for instance, that my movement is easily better than theirs, especially when it comes to things like sidestep duck. And yet I'm getting destroyed because they have the mental edge on me, and I think that's interesting. I think overcoming that is interesting. I don't think spending 3 hours in practice mode, quoting speed kicks here, actually going to practice mode for a day or a week or a month, X amount of time to get really good movement is interesting when that movement is only a tool in the psychological game at the end of the day, right? Because you'll get to a point where all things being equal, that's what Tekken comes down to. And that is so complicated to quantify because we're dealing with the beauty of the mind, and we're dealing with the beauty of language, and we're dealing with Tekken as a platform to express yourself. And don't be limited. Don't be confined to thinking I have to play this way. You're not helping yourself. And in fact, I think the community as a whole, if everyone thinks that way, we're not going to get better. And then when Pakistan comes and destroys the entire universe with their play style, everyone's so surprised. But in fact, if the mindset of the community was, oh no, Tekken's not this simple. There's so many options. iMusician is really just a Boa who does use move. Boa does not know what a poke is. Maybe he knows what down back four is, but it's just it allows for so much expressivity. It allows you to be very expressive, and I think Tekken as a platform for expressivity, forget that word. In competition is why Tekken is so interesting. Um, so develop your own play style, be unique, expand the meta. Don't tell people this is what Tekken is when you do not know what Tekken can be. Tekken is such a young game compared to other things. Tekken is not like chess, but in terms of age, it's even further from chess. The chess meta evolved. If you ask Paul Morphy what the chess meta was back in the day, maybe he would have said something like, "Oh, it's all about the psychological aspect and reading your opponent and knowing them." But it's hard to argue that what super GMs in chess are aiming for is to play like um, computers ultimately, because 99.99999% they're better than humans in the situation. There's a couple moves, right, where it might take a computer a few days at depth 1,000 to find, or maybe they don't even find it with the current hardware. But in general, right, you don't want to do something that is wrong because there is an option that's right against everyone, right? Uh, so yeah, I think Tekken is a much more interesting and much more diverse and much more complicated. I actually hate the word complicated now because I feel like it's loaded, but just a much more expressive and varied game that has so many interesting properties of human psychology, mathematics, game theory within it than just, you know, moving around really quickly. Because moving around really quickly is, guess what, not interesting. Because frankly, everyone's so freaked out about the movement system if it's easier. I don't want that to happen. I like, how difficult the movement system is. But if you think the movement system, once you get rid of it, the main interesting thing about Tekken is gone, then guess what? Tekken's not very complicated if that's your frame of mind. Because then it's just a matter of how many hours you spend in practice mode, which is just, I've spent 1,000+ hours in practice mode, and there are people who spend 0 hours in practice mode, and they can destroy me on a purely psychological game, and I'll lose. And I think that's just true of Tekken in general. Arslan versus Knee in the grand finals of Evo is the most poke heavy match maybe you'll ever see. And the movement is at a very high level, but guess what it came down to in the end? Arslan's mind game was a lot better. His movement was not better in the sense that his physical hand controlling the stick has more capability than Knee's. Maybe it does, it's very hard to argue. But his movement placing and his understanding of how to use movement as a tool, just like a move, just like a block, just like a low parry, in the context of who he's playing and the mind game at that time, I think was better. Yes, I personally try and play very much on a frame-based thing, and I used to think that frames were everything. If you knew every frame, you could beat your opponent because you're just going to do down forward one and in a certain situation do a homing move maybe. But Tekken's not that simple. Span your mind, blah, blah, blah. Sorry for the bit of a rant there, but I hope you learned something, I guess. Anyway, have a great day. Thank you so much for listening. Um, Twitter's in the description if you're interested. No need to follow, but if you have any questions, do let me know. And thank you very much.